Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us on this Thursday morning to learn about monarch butterflies, the biology and conservation of monarchs. Today, we have the pleasure of hearing Karen. Oh, Karen, you're going to have to pronounce your last name for me.
Oberhauser.
Oberhauser, just like it sounds. Karen Oberhauser, who is from the UW Madison Arboretum. She is the director there. And we connected with Karen through an organization called Badger Talks. So we are really excited to have her join us today. I'm Elisa Weiss. I'm the program manager at the Verona Senior Center. And on that note, I'm just going to hand it right over to Karen and say thank you so much for joining us today.
Sure, it's really fun to be here. I'm happy that this worked. And for those of you that don't know, we were having some technical issues until a couple minutes ago, and all of a sudden everything magically worked. So here we are together. So thanks for that introduction, and thanks for inviting me and to everyone who's here today. I'm not sure how many are in the room, but fun to be here with you from Verona. I'm in my office at the UW Madison Arboretum. I have been in this job at the Arboretum for almost 5 years. It's been a wonderful 5 years, and I came here from the University of Minnesota, where I worked for a long time as a researcher. So now I'm the director, as Elisa said, of the Arboretum. So I'm going to talk to you about monarchs today, and then I'm going to, at the end, kind of pull it together with what's going on at the Arboretum with monarchs. So if you have any questions about the Arboretum or things about monarchs that I don't cover, feel free to ask them. We will have, let me see if I can change, there we go. Just a few things that might make it easier. If you have questions in the chat box, so you can write questions in the chat box. I'm not seeing the chat box on my screen, but maybe Elisa, if any come up, or you can just ask me a question, raise your hand, or somehow show me that you want to ask a question. I can see faces here. And I'll take a few breaks for questions. It's a little easier when we're in the room together and I can see people raising their hands. I can't see that as well now. So we'll make sure we figure out a way to get to your questions. And if we run out of time, what I can do is see questions that are in the chat box, and I would be happy to send an email with answers to those questions to Elisa that she could share with you. So if we do run out of time, it's a little different in Zoom. I can't just stay there and chat with you in the room afterwards. So that's what I've worked out to get questions answered. So I'm going to start by just kind of summarizing the people I've worked with, because what we know about monarchs is really due to the efforts of a lot of different people. And like I said, I've only been in this job for almost 5 years. And before that, I had a long and wonderful career at the University of Minnesota, where I worked with just amazing graduate students and undergraduates through the years. So the people in the top picture here is my last group of students and staff at the University of Minnesota. Just as you can tell from looking at them, it's a really great group of people. And my new academic family is the staff at the University of Wisconsin Arboretum, as well as faculty and students on campus, but mostly I work with our staff at the Arboretum. Again, a wonderful group involved in land care and research focused on ecological restoration and education and outreach. And then I'm going to talk a little bit, and I could talk a lot more time about citizen science, but I wanted to kind of let you know in the beginning, and I'll talk more during the talk itself, how important citizen scientists have been to what we know about monarchs. So these are people all over North America who are out collecting data for us on monarchs during all phases of their migratory cycle. So really, we would not know what we do about monarchs without citizen scientists. So I just have a picture of a couple of them right here. And those two people happen to be my parents, who have been involved with monitoring monarchs for several decades. So I'm going to start talking about monarchs' life history. So just kind of give you some of the background biology about monarchs, which is very complex and very interesting. And I'm going to start talking about the life cycle of an individual monarch, and then move from that onto the migratory cycle of monarchs. So we'll start with the egg. A monarch is an egg for 4 to 5 days, depending on temperature. If it's warmer, it's shorter. If it's cooler, it can take longer. And if it's very cool, it can take up to 20 or more days for the egg to hatch. It's completely dependent on temperature. And this 4 to 5 days is kind of under normal summer conditions. You know, what's normal, but kind of in the 70 to 80 range is the 4 to 5 days. Then they're a caterpillar or a larva for about 9 to 13 days. Again, depending on temperature, it takes longer when it's cooler, shorter if it's warmer. If it gets too hot, they actually slow down development. They stop eating during the daytime. If it's too hot, they'll actually crawl down into the leaf litter. So the temperatures actually that we've been having over the last couple of days would actually slow their development down a bit. But under normal conditions, 9 to 13 days as a caterpillar. Then it's about 1 day less that they're a pupa or a chrysalis, again, depending on temperature. And then the adults have an interesting difference. So you'll notice that I wrote down here 2 to 6 weeks if they're, that happens for the butterflies that are not migratory. So the butterflies that we're seeing, that we're just in the last 2 days seeing in Wisconsin, will live 2 to 6 weeks as an adult. But the ones that emerge at the end of the summer and migrate to Mexico live 8 to 10 months. So the life cycle of an adult monarch depends on when it lives during this annual cycle, with the migratory ones living 8 to 10 months, and the summer non-migratory ones 2 to 6 weeks, or we can say about a month. So this whole life cycle to get from egg to adult takes about a month, and then add on about a month for an adult. So they live for a couple months if they're summer butterflies, and longer if they're not. And the ones that migrate they don't reproduce until the following spring. So if a butterfly emerges here, say in late August, it will be non-reproductive, and it'll migrate to Mexico, stay in Mexico all winter, and come back. So that's why it has to live 8 to 10 months. And it can live longer because it's in cool conditions, and it's not investing any energy in reproduction until the end of its life. So what do monarchs need during that individual life cycle? Well, the caterpillars only eat milkweed. So they're completely dependent on milkweed, but there are a lot of species of milkweed, over 100 of them, that are native to North America. And these milkweed plants contain chemicals called cardinalides. And these cardinalides are similar to digitoxin. It's in the same chemical class as digitoxin. And it affects vertebrates' hearts. So they make monarchs both taste bitter, and they can affect their hearts, or they make vertebrates. So if a vertebrate eats a monarch, it tastes bad to it. And if it eats too many of them, it can get really sick. So I just put a few pictures of different milkweed plants on here just to show you some of the variation. And we usually think of the United States as broken up into these regions when we're thinking about milkweed. So the milkweed that we would see around here, these 4 species over on the right, these are fairly common species here in the northeastern part of the country, or including the upper Midwest. This is whorled milkweed. This is common milkweed, swamp milkweed, and butterfly weed, the bright orange flowers down here. And you can see that the flowers are really different on all of these species, different shapes and different colors, but they all have the same kind of a star pattern. They have 5 parts to them. All of the flowers have the same basic morphology, even though the different parts are shaped slightly differently. This is a really fun milkweed. This one down here with the yellow flowers on the bottom grows in Arizona and a little bit into New Mexico. This is called desert milkweed, or Asclepias subulata. I like it a lot because it doesn't have leaves, and the caterpillars actually eat the stems. And this is not a monarch caterpillar that I took this picture of. This is a queen caterpillar, closely related to monarchs. You'll see it, pictures of monarch caterpillars later. So here we have the queen caterpillar. When they're adults, so the adults are fairly similar, males and females are fairly similar. But if we were all in a room, I would have you raise your hands, but you can just show each other if you know which one of these is the male and which one of these is the female. They are slightly different. And this one on the right is the male. And we can tell that it's the male because of these spots on the hind wings. So these two little tiny spots mean that this is a male. These are specialized scales that in related butterflies, but probably not in monarchs, release a chemical that attracts the females. So here's the female. She has slightly, it looks like her veins and her wings are slightly wider. They aren't wider. They just have more black or dark brown scales on them. And she is also has more brown scales mixed in with the orange. So you can see she looks not quite as bright as the male, but they're very similar. It's hard to tell them apart unless you're really familiar with their behavior when you look for them in the field. So when they're adults, when they're eggs and pupae, we don't have to worry about what they eat because they don't eat anything. When they're adults, the monarchs can nectar on a variety of flowers. While the larvae are specialists, the adults aren't. So these adults are nectaring on all sorts of species of flowers, completely unrelated flowers. Basically, they'll use whatever available. And so if you're gardening for monarchs or trying to support monarchs, it's important to have nectar plants that are available throughout the season. And early in the season, we often don't have a lot of flowers around. I showed a picture here of a lilac. Lilacs are not a native plant to North America, but they're fairly common. And monarchs love to nectar on lilacs. They also like dandelions, and the dandelions are just coming out. So that's good if there are some dandelions available for monarchs as they're just moving in to Wisconsin right now. And then these are species that are more common throughout the season. Okay, so that was the individual life cycle. Now I'm just going to show you with a map what they're doing throughout the course of the year. So this I call the annual life cycle. And it also has 4 stages like the individual life cycle does: migrating south, overwintering, migrating north, and breeding. So the ones that are migrating south, I told you that they don't reproduce until the following spring. So they're in a physiological condition that's called diapause. There's that word right here. Diapause is just a slowing down of development. So even though the adults that are migrating look like the butterflies in the summer, if you looked inside them, their reproductive organs would be not developed. So it's kind of like they're arrested in a juvenile state. So those are migrating south, and the lines on the map show you kind of where they're going. They're leaving this whole northern part of their breeding range east of the Rocky Mountains, funneling down through Texas and getting to overwintering sites in Mexico. Similar thing is happening west of the Rocky Mountains, but they're going to sites along the coast of California. But there is interchange between these two populations. So we know that some monarchs that have been tagged or marked in Arizona have shown up at these overwintering sites in Mexico. So it's not like they're completely separate populations, just sort of separate. So they're following the lines on this map, and really they're not following lines, they're just moving from this whole area south. They're doing this starting in about the middle of August. We do know that some monarchs from the east coast of the United States that are east of the Appalachian Mountains, so most of them go along the Gulf Coast and through Texas into these overwintering sites, but we know that some end up in southern Florida. We don't know if they just miss that turn to the west and go down into southern Florida, but there's a population of monarchs down there that breeds all year, and some of the monarchs from the east join that population in the winter. So they arrive in Mexico starting in early November, and they just stay in those spots all winter. And then starting in the middle of March, butterflies start moving out of Mexico, and the butterflies that overwintered move into kind of the southeastern quarter of the United States. And then it's their offspring that continue the migration north. So I showed that with these broken arrows here, that these butterflies are not the same butterflies that overwintered. So the butterflies that are coming back here right now are the new generation of 2022, whereas these were born in 2021, the ones that came out of Mexico. And again, similar happening with the Western population. Then they go through 2 to 3 non-migratory generations. So 2 to 3 generations that don't have directional flight. They just stay up here and build up their population. And then the cycle starts again. And one of the reasons that we know so much about monarchs is because they gather together in these overwintering sites at the end of each year. And then we can assess how the population is doing, because most of them are together. In Mexico, we measure the area of land that's occupied by trees covered with monarchs. And in California, people actually count the butterflies. So let's look at that cycle, thinking about what monarchs need during each phase of that annual cycle. So we'll start again with the fall migration, and what they need as they're migrating south in the fall is they don't need milkweed because they're not reproducing. They need a lot of nectar, and they actually gain weight. So they're gaining energy reserves that they use throughout the course of the whole winter as they're migrating south. So here's a butterfly in my backyard in Minnesota, nectaring on ironweed. They also need places to stop at night. They don't migrate at nighttime like some birds do. So they stop in trees. This is a mesquite tree.
Yeah, my headphones back on,
Texas.
sorry.
Okay, so here we have the butterflies migrating south. Then when they get to the overwintering sites in Mexico, basically they just need to stay alive. So they've made it there. A lot don't make it, but the ones that do just need to stay alive. So they hang out in the trees. Sometimes you see these big flights where they'll fly off of the trees, but for the most of the time, they're just saving up their energy, just hanging in the trees looking like this. And then when they start moving north in the middle of March, moving into Texas, now they start needing milkweed. So here's a little tiny milkweed plant, and they will find the little plants. They have to do a lot of searching, but they'll find these teeny tiny plants as they're moving north. This picture was taken in Oklahoma. It's called a green milkweed plant. And again, they need nectar. They always need nectar. And then when they get up here into their summer breeding grounds, this is when the population is really expanding. So they need lots and lots of milkweed. So here's a caterpillar eating milkweed. They need this female is laying eggs on a milkweed plant, and they need nectar. So this is a chain. In order for the monarch population to survive, everything that I've shown you on this slide needs to be intact. They need these resources over the course of a lot of land that I showed you in the maps in the previous slides. So this all has to work in order for monarchs to keep living. But whenever I go to Mexico and look at those butterflies hanging in the trees, what I think about is the amazing story that each of them represents. And every single one of those stories that's behind each butterfly here started out on a milkweed plant. And for most of them, that milkweed plant was in the upper Midwest. So what happens to monarchs up here is really, really important. This is the beginning of the whole thing. This is where all the monarchs that get to Mexico come from. Some milkweed plant that was there for a monarch butterfly. And it takes lots and lots of them to feed all these monarchs. So I talked a little bit about citizen science. Oh, we have some people talking. Kristen, maybe you could. Okay.
Oh, sorry.
Not
So
me.
monarchs are monitored by a lot of citizen scientists all through the country. And what I did here is just kind of divided this into the whole migratory cycle. And we don't need to know all of these programs over here, but just suffice it to say that each one of these programs represents some phase of the cycle. So people are going out and monitoring monarchs and providing us with their data so that we can understand what's going on with the population. Some of the programs that I've listed at the top here monitor all butterflies, not just monarchs, and some monitor monarchs as well. And we can learn from all of these programs. And I don't have time to go into very many of these, but I'm just going to talk a bit about the ones that are highlighted here, because these are programs that we run at the University of Wisconsin Arboretum, the Monarch Larva Monitoring Project and Journey North. So starting with Journey North, this picture that's a screenshot from the web shows you the fall migration of monarchs. So what each one of these dots represents is somebody seeing a cluster of monarchs during the fall migration. And you can see that the earlier dates are colored lighter, and later they get darker and darker. So this is showing you the bulk of the monarchs. So this is where most of the monarchs are flying down what we call the Central Flyway, flying down through Texas and getting into northern Mexico. And this picture was a screenshot from October. So they haven't quite reached those overwintering sites in Mexico, but this is basically showing us the trail of monarchs. And you can see that at least last fall, there weren't that many roosting sites sited in the eastern part of the country. There tend to be fewer of them out there, so people don't see the big aggregations, and they're less likely to see an individual monarch. So we don't see as many sites in the east, but this just is showing you that this is where the bulk of monarchs are coming from, the upper Midwest. And in case you're interested, I downloaded this just before I started because this is changing so quickly right now. So I wanted to give you an up to the minute report on where monarchs are right now. If we would have looked at this map 2 days ago, 2 mornings ago, so I looked on the morning of May 10th, there were no monarchs that had been sighted in Wisconsin, none had been sighted in Michigan, and there were just a few in the southern part of Minnesota. So all of the darker red colors on here have been just in the last couple days, starting on May 10th. So they're just right now starting to come in. I have still not seen a monarch, but I'm getting calls from a lot of friends who say they've seen a monarch. So each one of these dots represents somebody seeing their first monarch of the year. So somebody went out in northeastern Indiana and saw a monarch butterfly and reported it to the Journey North website. So we have this individual record right here. And all of the records, this isn't live, it's just a screenshot, but all of the circles that have a little black or little white square in the middle of them there's a picture. So you can click, if you haven't seen a monarch for a while, you can click on this. So you can see these maps. It's really easy to find them if you just go to the website that's called journeynorth.org. And this is the spring map of monarchs. So this is your up-to-date report on where monarchs are now. So you can see as the lighter colors, as they were coming out of Mexico, people seeing them along the Gulf Coast. And the kind of yellowish colors are the monarchs that overwintered in Mexico. And then the redder colors are the next generation of the year that are coming up here. So it's really fun to get these reports. And then the other program that we run at the Arboretum is the Monarch Larva Monitoring Project. And I started this 26 years ago at the University of Minnesota. And this is a program where people are going out into their backyards or nature centers or somewhere else and looking for monarchs on milkweed plants, like these 2 kids are doing. If they find a monarch on a milkweed plant, they report it. So they have sites that they monitor regularly. They can be gardens or parks or roadsides, anything that has milkweed. They provide us with a site description, and then they do weekly monitoring where they go out and count the number of milkweed plants that they look at and how many eggs and caterpillars they see. And I saved this picture for now because this is what our volunteers in this program are looking for, all these different stages of caterpillars. So here's an egg. A monarch egg is about the size of a pinhead. So the volunteers are looking for these eggs. And then out of that little pinhead sized egg comes a first instar caterpillar, which is small enough to fit inside a pinhead. It is the tiniest stage, and then it sheds its skin and becomes a second instar, sheds its skin again and becomes a third instar. This one sheds again and becomes a fourth, and then again and becomes a fifth instar caterpillar. So the volunteers need to tell the difference between these, and it's actually pretty easy once you start looking closely at them to tell all these different stages apart. So during the time that monarchs are caterpillars, they increase their body mass from the little caterpillar that hatches out of the egg to the big one that's going to form the chrysalis. They increase their body mass over these 10 to 11 days 2,000 times. So to kind of think of how much that is, you can think of a 7-pound baby. And if it increased its body mass 2,000 times, it would weigh 14,000 pounds. So that's a lot of weight gain for these caterpillars. We have over 1,000 sites in the United States. Here's a map. You can see most of them are in the eastern part of the United States, with a few in the West. And we have a volunteer in Denver who's working really hard to recruit volunteers there. So that's why we have this little cluster of sites around Denver, Colorado. But most of our sites are for the eastern migratory population. But we can really tell a lot about monarchs from these people. Okay, so I'm going to stop now just because I covered a lot there, and just kind of check in with you. And if anyone has questions, you could ask those questions now. You could just unmute yourself and ask.
I have a question.
All right, looks like Wendy.
Yeah. Will the monarchs show up in my area even if the milkweed is just barely popping up?
Yeah, so that's a really, really good question. And we always worry about that every year. This year, like you said, the milkweed is just starting to pop up, and these warm days are going to make it grow pretty quickly. So they will be looking for milkweed. It's harder for them to find it when it's so little. So, you know, we just hope that they can sort of hang out until the milkweed does come up in the next few days. It should be coming up now, and it grows pretty quickly once it starts. So yes, they might find your milkweed when it's, you know, just a couple inches tall.
Awesome. Thank you.
Hello.
Yep.
Hello. May I ask a question?
Sure.
This is Anna. I wonder, you said the fourth generation of the year which is migrating, their reproductive system underdeveloped. So how they reproduce overall? They have to reproduce at some point, right?
Yeah.
So how does it work?
Yeah. So
Thank you.
great question. And that the answer is kind of a physiological one. So they have, there are hormones in their body that kind of suppress the development of their reproductive organs. They're called juvenile hormone. There's 2 different hormones, and those suppress the development of their reproductive organs. And then at the end of the winter, when the days are getting longer and it's getting warmer, then the levels of that suppression hormone go down in their body, and then their reproductive organs develop. So it's driven by cues from the environment and then changes in hormones in their body. So they do become reproductive at the end of the winter. And thanks for asking that question to clarify that.
Hi, is just planting more and more milkweed the best support? I have a prairie strip in the back of my house. And I have lots of echinacea, black-eyed Susans, a variety of asters and prairie plants with milkweed. But is it just one milkweed type, or should I plant multiple milkweed types? And what kind of density should I look for?
Yeah, so great question. And so, like I said, there are lots of kinds of milkweed. And the answer to that question really is to have a variety of species. And the reason for that is because some of them do well in wet conditions, some in dry conditions, some are better at the beginning of the summer, some are better at the end of the summer. So if you have a lot of them in any given year and at any given time during that year, there's a better likelihood that some of it will be in good condition for the monarchs. So the more milkweed you can plant, both the numbers of plants and also the different species of plants, the better. Yeah, planting milkweed, the flowers are important. We can't just think of the milkweed, we have to think of the flowers too, but planting milkweed is going to be good for them. And the biggest number of species you can get your hands on.
You mentioned in the beginning there were 4 different kinds in our geographic area. Could you repeat those 4 different milkweed species?
Yeah, I can, but I'm also, I'm gonna send Elisa, there's a link to there's something called the Wisconsin Monarch Collaborative. I'm just gonna go move in my office and pull something out to show you. So I'll tell you those 4 again, but we've developed this handout that has, I don't know if you can see this very well, but it has all the species. We actually have 12 kinds of species that live, and I showed you the most common ones. So the most common ones are common milkweed and swamp milkweed. Some people call that rose milkweed because they think swamp sounds bad, but swamp milkweed, butterfly weed, which is the one with the bright orange flowers. It's beautiful. And then something called whorled milkweed, and that's spelled W-H-O-R-L-E-D, whorled milkweed. So those are the 4 most common kinds of milkweed that we have here. And they're the easiest ones to find in nurseries, and the other ones are much more rare and harder to find. Yeah, so I will send a link to this document so any of you can make copies of this document. Maybe I'll just send the PDF of the document.
I have a question from somebody in-house over here, Karen.
Mhm.
Does taking eggs and caterpillars inside to raise them help the population?
It helps those individual monarchs because there is a lot of mortality. So about 95% of them don't make it to become adults. So the individual monarchs that you bring in will help them, and it'll make you learn about monarchs and care more about monarchs if you do that. But we don't recommend rearing large numbers of monarchs. There are some risks to that from rearing them in crowded conditions or from them not being exposed to the normal outside cues. And also it takes a lot of time to rear that many monarchs, and you can never really rear enough to make a difference in the population. So it does help those individual monarchs. We can learn a lot from that. But if you're going to spend a lot of time helping monarchs, you should spend it planting milkweed and taking care of prairies. That's the best thing you can do to help them.
Thank you.
Mhm.
I
All
have
right.
a question.
Okay, go ahead.
I was wondering, are they native to every state in the country, or looking at your map, we don't see them in a lot of states on that map? And I know I live in Montana now from Wisconsin, and there aren't many here. And I'm wondering if it's lack of milkweed or if that's typical for certain states not to see them.
Yeah, there are fewer of them through the middle, through the Rocky Mountain states. So Montana has some. I have seen a monarch in Montana. You know, there are monarchs in Utah, Colorado. They're there, but they're rare. And we tend not to get a lot of volunteers looking for them where they don't see very many. So they have not been sighted in Alaska. They do exist in Hawaii, and they've been found in every state except Alaska, but they're not very common through the kind of the western mountainous states. Yep.
I
All
have a
right, so,
question.
oh, go ahead.
How do you tell a difference between a monarch and painted lady?
Great question. Well, a monarch, for one thing, a monarch is bigger. I was just going to pull out a butterfly book, but it would take me a while to find that. I think I won't do that right here. And I have other presentations where I have a slide of that, but the monarch is bigger. And the painted lady does not have these kind of distinct color patterns. It's the color patterns on a painted lady are splotchier. There are more kind of splotches of color. You don't see these wing veins as distinctly, but there are still white spots on them, and a lot of people get them mixed up. Size is the biggest thing, where the painted ladies are smaller than monarchs.
Okay.
Yep, good question.
I was raising painted ladies and they were about this big from
Yep.
the tip to the antenna. So a
Mhm.
monarch would be about this big?
Yep, a monarch would be bigger. Yeah, a monarch is, it's about 4 inches across if you measure from the tip of one wing to the tip of the other wing. Yeah, they're fair amount bigger. All right, I'm going to move on and start talking about more about conservation of monarchs. So we do know that monarch numbers are declining. And I told you that we measure monarchs in Mexico in hectare. We measure it by area. So we look for trees that look like this, that are covered with monarchs, and see how much area that covers. So this graph is showing you all the years of monitoring monarchs. We've been doing that since 1993. We don't have the data from last winter yet. They haven't been released by the government in Mexico. But here we have the numbers of monarchs. You can see there's a lot of variation. The numbers go up and down a lot, but there's a general downward trend here. And one way to think about this is to think about the averages over decades. So what we call 10-year averages. So for the last 10 years, the mean area occupied by monarchs is 2.6 hectares. And a hectare is equal to about 2.5 acres. So you can kind of imagine the size of 2.5. But even in the last decade, we've had one really good year, the winter of 2018 that went into 2019. And then the numbers have been going down since then. Again, we haven't gotten the numbers from last winter yet. So, we had one really low year. And this year, all the monarchs from east of the Rocky Mountains fit into an area about the size of a football field. And this was a very big year. This is the first year that I started going to Mexico to study them. So I got to see this, and I also got to see this. So that's a big decline. The decade before this, in the early 2000s, the mean was almost 6 hectares. So we did get up to that once. So one time in the last 10 years, we got up to the average of the previous 10 years. And then before that, we don't have quite 10 years, but that mean was 8.7. So the numbers are declining. And we know that what's causing, what these numbers are associated with are the amount of breeding habitat that's available to them, and also hot weather. So hot weather is associated with lower monarch populations. So that's not the greatest sign, because we know that climate change models predict more hot weather in the future. So what that means is we just have to have as much habitat available to them as possible so that they can find places where the weather isn't bad in any given year. So we know, for example, last year, it was pretty cold and wet in the northeastern part of the country. It was really dry and hot in the west, but we had a fairly average year here in the Midwest. So even with climate change, there's going to be a lot of variation. So we want to have a lot of habitat available to them. So the monarch numbers are declining. So here's, and you've already asked me a bit about this, so I can kind of go through this. What do we do about that? How do we stop the decline in monarch numbers that I showed you was happening? So really what we need to do is think about what are our opportunities for putting in habitat for monarchs. And one opportunity is in urban and suburban spaces. So places where we live, schools, places where we work, our churches, we can put in habitat. And this was my house in St. Paul, Minnesota. And this was my yard. And I got a lot of monarchs in my yard. I had a lot of milkweed and a lot of host plants, and the monarchs found my yard, even though my neighbors' yards were not as friendly to monarchs. In fact, this red thing right here in the back is my neighbor was not very happy about my garden, and they put up a big fence between my yard and theirs. Unfortunately, this is
We cannot hear you.
The speaker is muted. Oh,
there. I just unmuted. Now you should be able to hear me. Yeah, so this is what yards tend to look like, and this is what people like. And what I think we need to do is just change people's minds about what their lawn should look like. I mean, I look at this and I think that nothing can live in that. Basically, this is Kentucky bluegrass. This is not even a native grass. So people are putting this invasive grass in their yards, a non-native invasive grass, and it's not providing habitat for anyone. So we need to change the way we think about what a nice yard looks like. We can also use what is called agricultural set-aside land. So this is land that was farmed and it's been pulled out of production. It can be in CRP, it can be in other programs. This is a program in Iowa called the STRIPS program, where they're putting in habitat in between the cornfields. Now there are risks to this because often cornfields are sprayed with insecticides. But really, if you have driven through Iowa, most of Iowa is corn and soybean fields. So the monarchs need something. So even though they might have a lower survival rate in these strips, at least they have some survival rate, and at least some of them will find milkweed plants in here, and a lot of them will survive. So this is something we're really working on, this agricultural set-aside land. Rights of ways are another place where we can put monarch habitat. And these kinds of habitats are nice because they're linear, and monarchs can move from monarchs and a lot of other species. You know, what we do for monarchs is helping a lot of other species as well. But these rights of ways, so this is Highway 35 in Minnesota, goes all the way from Duluth, Minnesota down to the border with Mexico through Texas and a lot of other states. So we can put habitat along these roads, along utility line rights of ways, along railroad rights of ways. And this can be good habitat. We need to mow this land right next to the road, has to be mowed because for safety reasons. So we shouldn't put milkweed in there because that would be a death trap for monarchs if they were growing on milkweed there and it got mowed. But this area does not have to be mowed and can provide really great habitat. So here we see the mowing, just to kind of show you that this mowing doesn't just occur along the big freeways, the interstates. It occurs along the really small roads out in the country too. So we need to think of that when we're putting habitat in rights of ways. And the other area is land that's already protected. This is land that we don't need to put any kind of conservation easements on. We don't need to change a lot, but we can make sure that land that's already protected is better for monarchs. So this is a grassland. This is a Forest Service grassland. We think about the Forest Service just having forests, but they also have a lot of grasslands that they protect and manage. So this one is in South Dakota, but lots and lots of public land that can be protected for monarchs. And then the last area that I want to talk about is a little harder. And this is land that's called marginal agricultural land. This is land that is farmed. And here we see this picture was taken in Wisconsin. This is a cornfield. It flooded. It happens a lot of years. I'm sure a lot of you have seen scenes like this where farmers plant their corn and it starts coming up, and then we get huge rainstorms that flood the fields, and the corn is then killed. So if we took out some of this land that is put into agriculture, but doesn't really produce crops very reliably, this would give us a lot more land that could be protected for monarchs and other species. Jerry, you have a question. You could unmute yourself and ask it if you want.
There we go.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
I can.
All right. So I have a 38-acre field that is in hay. It's mostly just planted in hay, and it is also has crop strips. So my question is, I talked with our farm service agency, and they could do some pollinator planting in there, but they want to spray with glyphosate first. And that concerns me. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that as far as how that might affect pollinators like bees and monarchs. And, I just kind of worry about the spraying application.
Yeah, that is a great question. And, there are going to be a lot of opinion, a lot of different answers. I'm going to give you my opinion, but I'll tell you right off that there are people who disagree with me.
Sure.
So glyphosate, the trade name for that is Roundup, for those of you that don't know. It's a very commonly used herbicide. And now one of the reasons that monarchs have lost so much habitat, and it's good I have a cornfield picture up here, is that almost all the corn that's planted now is genetically modified to be resistant to glyphosate. And that means that the corn can come up and then the farmers can spray glyphosate on their field. There used to be quite a lot of milkweed in cornfields and in soybean fields. It's gone now. It's gone from all these fields, and that was an important source of habitat for monarchs. So glyphosate is one of the biggest drivers of monarch decline, not because it hurts monarchs, but because it kills weeds, and it killed milkweed in corn and soybean fields. And you just think of Wisconsin, Minnesota, Iowa, Illinois, there's a lot of land covered with corn and soybeans, and that land used to have some milkweed in it, and monarchs use that milkweed. So that I blame glyphosate for the decline of monarchs. But that said, one of the easiest ways to restore land is to use glyphosate, because if you have areas that have a lot of weeds in them, a lot of invasive plants, it's really hard to start a prairie. It's possible, but it takes a lot of work. It's a lot harder, and it takes a lot more time to start a prairie. So the quickest and easiest way to start good habitat is to use a bad chemical, and that's glyphosate. Now, glyphosate, if you look at, I've done a lot of reading about herbicides. Glyphosate is one of the least toxic. It's toxic to plants, but it has what we call a short half-life. So it doesn't survive that long in the habitat. It's gone pretty quickly. So it doesn't have a long-lasting impact. So I think it can be used for good. There are people who don't. And one of the ways, and I've talked to a lot of people who do this, one of the ways, if you don't want to use glyphosate, which I commend, what you can do is, it takes longer and more work, but you can take what's there and mow it. And then you can broadcast the seeds, the prairie seeds, and then you can just keep mowing those weeds. And the weeds tend to be annuals. They grow more quickly, so you will do less damage to the plants that you put in there and more damage to the weeds. And eventually, and burning is good too. So there are sites, I know people who work with prairie enthusiasts, and I've done some volunteering for them. They have started really nice prairies without using glyphosate. It takes longer, and they have to just keep mowing or burning, but eventually those prairie plants win out.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. All right. So basically we've been kind of talking about this already, but you know, given that those are our opportunities for creating habitat, what could you do as people interested in helping monarchs? Creating habitat is the biggest one. This is a little park. You know, it doesn't look like a city park, but it is. This was in St. Paul, Minnesota. There are a lot of houses around this park. And the city had actually created, this is a stormwater pond, and they planted prairie plants, and it's a great habitat. So it's right in a city. Creating habitat can be done. You can contribute to Monarch Citizen Science. So I told you about the Journey North program. When you see a monarch, you can just report that monarch, and that helps us learn more about monarchs. And I will send a link also that describes some of the different citizen science projects that people can get started with. Oops, sorry. You can support conservation organizations, any organization that's working to preserve habitat, from big national ones like the Nature Conservancy to a small nature center right in your town. Anybody that's creating and protecting habitat needs financial support. Now you've heard me, you're an expert on monarchs, you can spread the word, you can tell other people. So really, monarchs are something that can live in people's backyards. So the more people that understand that and create habitat for them, the better. And then this is the hardest one here, because we know that monarchs will be hurt by climate change. You can do what you can to mitigate climate change. So whatever we can do to decrease our greenhouse gas emissions is really important. So these are the big 5 things you can do. And I'm just going to end, and then we'll have some more time for questions, by talking about the Arboretum. So I've spent my whole career, from the time I was a graduate student until now, studying monarch butterflies and working to protect them. And when I took this job, when I moved away from Minnesota and took this job at the Arboretum, a lot of my friends, my monarch friends, were kind of surprised, because I'm really the monarch lady here. But this, in the end, is really, I think, a perfect job for me. And I just wanted to tell you a few things about the Arboretum. Probably a lot of you have been here. You should come as soon as you can, because it is just beautiful right now. The lilacs have popped out in the last couple days. The Longenecker Horticultural Garden is just gorgeous, and the prairies are just coming into their own. So if you haven't been here for a while, come soon. It's beautiful. So I wanted to just read this quote, which was a speech that was given by Aldo Leopold at our dedication in 1934. So we're getting on almost 90 years. And he said, "This in a nutshell is the function of the Arboretum. It's a reconstructed sample of old Wisconsin to serve as a benchmark, a starting point in the long and laborious job of building a permanent and mutually beneficial relationship between civilized men and a civilized landscape." And that's really what we're all about, is to support a relationship between people and the land. And Leopold recognized that way back in the 1930s, and that's what he dedicated. That's what the land ethic is. That means we think about the land in everything that we do, and that's what the Arboretum is trying to encourage. So I said the best thing we can do for monarchs is to create habitat. Well, the Arboretum has 1,200 acres of habitat. We're right smack dab. You can see at the very top of this picture taken from the sky, that's the Madison skyline. All this green around here is where you can see the little dots. Those are neighborhoods. This is Fish Hatchery Road over here. This is the Beltline. Beltline goes right through the Arboretum. You can see on this map. So, but this is our little pocket of land right here. That's the golf course, the Nakoma Golf Course. So little pieces of it are carved out with houses, but we have 1,200 acres here. This is the Grady Tract south of the Beltline, so 17 miles of hiking trails. It's just a great place. And most of this land is managed as natural habitat. We have this prairie, Curtis Prairie is the first restored prairie in the world. So it's really a lot going on here for monarchs and so many other species. We also have, a lot of people don't know this, but we also manage 513 acres outside of our land in Madison. These are a whole bunch of different, what we call outlying properties. Most of them are down here in the southern part of the state, but we have one way up north near Minocqua called Finnerud Forest. That's the biggest one, 141 acres. But land of varying sizes, a lot of these are state natural areas. So we also, in addition to managing our 1,200 acres, manage these properties, which are beautiful habitat for lots of things. They're just, if you like prairies, this Oliver Prairie, it's tiny, it's just a little postage stamp prairie, but right now it's just covered with shooting stars. They're really, really wonderful habitat. And one of the most important things about us, I said that what we do here is research, land care, and outreach and education, but our land care is heavily focused on restoration. And not only are we doing restoration on the land that we're managing, but we're the birthplace of the research field of restoration ecology. So our prairie, Curtis Prairie that you could see from above, I said is the first restored prairie in the world. And since that prairie was restored in the 1930s, we've continued to collect data and are figuring out what is the best way to do long-term management of a prairie. These plants were just put in 1936, and it's a 60-acre prairie that had been an overgrazed pasture. So this is what you can do if you really work on your land and have a lot of time and keep working on it. So we're lucky that this land has been managed by people since the inception who have cared about it and taken care of it. So I just want to end by saying a lot of times when I talk to people, they'll just say, it must be really depressing. You know, here's a study organism that I started studying when the population was about 10 times bigger than it is now. It's really noticeable. You know, I notice years that monarchs aren't doing well, and they're never doing as well as they did when I first started studying them. But as a conservation biologist, I think that what we're doing to help monarchs is really important. And part of the importance of that is monarchs exist in this really interesting mosaic of rare and pristine habitat. They live in prairies. Prairies are one of the most threatened landscapes in the entire world, but they also can live in common and very disturbed habitats. Milkweed grows. It'll grow in people's yards. It used to grow in corn and soybean fields, which are about as disturbed as you can get. So they'll grow along roadsides. They grow pretty much everywhere. And Jerry, I would guess that you probably have some milkweed already in the land that you're using for haying. Milkweed is a pretty great species that grows in pretty easily in a lot of places. Monarchs are incredibly interesting. I didn't even talk about so many aspects of their biology, but just the fact that they can migrate is an amazing, amazing thing. And we still have a lot to learn from them about how they make their way in the world. And finally, their migration is an unmatched biological phenomenon. There are other butterflies that migrate. In fact, I got the question about painted ladies. Painted ladies migrate, but no other insect migrates in as regular a way as monarchs do. Monarchs kind of migrate a little bit like birds in really predictable ways. They're going to predictable places when they go to the south, and that's the same with birds. You know, any given bird species, most of them are going to a fairly small area where they overwinter. But the amazing thing about monarchs, those birds learn. They learn from their parents and other birds of their species. Monarchs just know where to go. It was their great-great-grandparents that did that journey the last time, and somehow they figure that out in ways that we still don't really understand. So it's just incredible what they can do. So I really feel like what we do, and I am encouraged by the fact that the population, while we're not getting it to increase yet, that's going to take a lot of people getting involved, a lot more people putting in habitat for them. But they're holding their own. We're kind of holding our own right now. And but I feel like we're holding our own in waiting for more people to understand how important it is to preserve natural habitat. So I'm going to stop with that. And if I'll be happy to answer more questions. And we can end when you're done with questions. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that I can see you. Oh, there's a lot in the chat. Yeah, I wasn't seeing. Oh, we had a lot of people.
Excuse me.
Yeah, go ahead.
I have a question. How to convince your neighbors not to pesticide?
Yeah, that's a hard one. And I actually never managed to convince the neighbor that put up the big fence that neighbor really liked green lawn. And they did pesticide. So I think, you know, you have to be gentle when you talk to people. And I think, you know, having like maybe showing your neighbor if you have butterflies or caterpillars, or if there's something you really like about your flowers, what you have in your yard that's growing besides a pristine green lawn. So you can't ever be mean about it, and you can't be preachy about it. You know, you can't go in and say, well, I'm right and you're wrong. You just need to kind of convince them gradually. And a lot of that is by example. And, you know, while that one neighbor of mine didn't change their ways, a lot of other people did start putting in more native plants in my neighborhood. So doing it, putting a sign up, being willing to talk to them. I wish you good luck with that.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And I see the question about a plant list. I'm just going to make myself a little list of things to send. And there's a lot online. But basically native plants. You should come to the Arboretum on Saturday to get native plants so Mabel asked a plant list for your yard. We're having a native plant sale here on Saturday, May 14th, with a lot of great plants, including milkweeds. So that would be a good one to check out. Okay, I was also going to send you the milkweeds of Wisconsin. Okay, I'm just looking here through the chat box. Is there value in creating a butterfly puddle artificially? Monarchs are not great puddlers, but a lot of butterflies are. So yes, I would say there is value in having a butterfly puddle, and you will see some butterflies at it. Sometimes monarchs you'll see on a really hot, dry day, but they aren't known as puddling butterflies. Good that Noe has planted a lot of milkweed. That's great. Yeah, so Roundup has some additional ingredients that some say are more toxic and long lasting. Sometimes they do put something that makes it evaporate more slowly in Roundup. I don't know that they put more toxic ingredients. That would have to be labeled, but definitely things that make them last longer. And there are a lot of other herbicides, so you have to be careful what you're buying. Yeah, and that Mabel said solarize the soil. That is another way to do it. It's really hard to solarize the soil. I have done that in some fairly large areas. You know, the problem with that, with solarizing the soil, is it uses a lot of plastic, and it's hard to, that plastic often gets holes in it, so you can't, speaking from experience, it's hard to use it again. But what that means, solarizing the soil, is you put usually black plastic on top of it. Some people use clear plastic, and that it gets so hot in there that it kills all of the plants instead of using an herbicide. So it is something to do. It'd be hard to do that on 38 acres. So kind of depends on the area you're talking about. But I have done it in an orchard. I've used solarization. So putting plastic down, but boy, I hated to have all that plastic left at the end of the year. Yeah, and somebody talked about no mow May. That's a really great thing. And somebody said, is it true that monarchs do not leave Florida to migrate? Some probably do and some don't. We don't really know all the details of what's going on with that Florida population. So they do, there is some movement out of Florida in the spring, but we don't know if those are monarchs that have, you know, just come from Mexico and hung out in Florida for a while, or if they're ones that have been there longer. So there's a lot we don't know about monarchs in Florida. Let's see. Yeah, and Anne said, if you purchase milkweed plants from a nursery, this is a really good point. You need to be sure that they aren't treated with pesticides. So there is a new class of pesticides, well, new in about the last decade, called neonicotinoids, or neonics for short. And a lot of plants you get from a nursery, especially if it's a big box nursery, they don't do this in the native plant places. If they're selling just native plants, none of the ones that we have at our Arboretum sale are treated. But in some cases, they've been treated. And a lot of people are trying to get labeling laws in place. They aren't in place yet, but you can ask if they've been treated with insecticides. And it's true, you're right, Anne, that they will kill monarchs. Okay, we did. Okay, I'm going to go down to new messages. Would there be a group or groups to reach out to that would help with controlled burning and establishing a large prairie? So that's a good question. There are not groups that would do this for free for you, but there are definitely groups. So any of the land management, land restorations, there's one called Good Oak, another one called Adaptive Restoration. They do a lot of management for private landowners, and they can actually help you from start to finish. My daughter used to work for them. So yeah, Adaptive Restoration, but there are other ones, and their names aren't coming to me right now. That's maybe the biggest one around here that can help you. So yeah, and they will help you establish it, and then they will help you manage it from then on, so that you can get them to come every year and do burns and do spot control of weeds. They will use herbicides. They won't do it without using herbicides. All right, let's see. Other questions? Anyone else have a question? I might not have gotten them. So if I did, I tried to see all of them. All right, I'm going to stop my share here. And again, now I could see you all. So if anyone has a question, you can raise your hand. Okay. Jerry says, can you send other groups? I will ask someone here for a complete list. All right. So Elisa, is it best to communicate resources to you, and can you get them out to all the people who are here?
So I think it might be best to go through the person from Badger Talk. I don't,
Okay.
Unfortunately, I have a few emails of some of the people here. So I would say send it my way, certainly.
Okay.
But I would also send it to the coordinator Because there's a ton of people on here today and I don't know over half of them. So that's amazing.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Yeah, and what I'm going to do is just put my screen up again because my email address is right there. So if you heard about this somewhere else and not through Elisa, then just send me an email and I will respond and get back to you with information.
And this will also be recorded and shared to our Verona Senior Center YouTube channel as well for people to share or watch again if they need to.
All right, good. Well,
Thank
thank
you.
you.
Yes, I
Yeah.
learned so much today. I hope all of you did too. And thank you for working with us through our little technology glitches. It was a pleasure to have all of you today. And Karen, you did an amazing job. I learned so much.
Well, thank you. It was really fun. And thanks for all your good questions. Appreciate them.
All right.
All right.
Everybody have a wonderful rest of your day.
All right. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks. That